Welcome everyone to an interesting webinar on implementing compliance, security, and privacy from folks who actually do it. Welcoming here Alia, Luria from InfrontCompliance, Tim Fairweather from Arctiq, Faraz, Rana, Brad, and Ian Purvis. I will kick off with having them introduce themselves from left to right, I guess. That's how the panel is on the top on my screen. Just briefly, I'm the founder of Polymer. We do privacy products around data security for Fintechs mostly, but also medical. So over to you, Alia.
Hi, I'm Alia Luria. I am the co-founder and CTO of InfrontCompliance. I'm also a licensed attorney. And Infront does primarily compliance assessment and monitoring for third-party risk and highly regulated industries.
Ian? Yep. Hi. Good morning. Good afternoon, everybody. Ian Purvis, VP at OpenFin. OpenFin, if you don't know us, we're described as the operating system of finance. So we have some of the most kind of innovative apps running on our OpenFin OS. Deployed out to the financial institutions.
Tim, you can kick it off. Yeah.
Yep, Tim Fairweather, partner here at Arctiq. We're a consulting firm, primarily based out of Canada, but servicing customers for globally for DevOps solutions and security solutions. I should say integrated security solutions. So.
All right, Faraz.
Hey folks, Faraz, Rana, I'm the Chief Legal Officer at Bread. We're a point-of-sale consumer finance company, and like Ali, I'm a lawyer as well. I joined Bread as employee number 5. So very early on, I've seen the company grow from 5 people to about a couple hundred people now.
Okay, so the goal here is to talk more on-the-ground realities in terms of the actual challenges and opportunities and around implementing compliance and security. So format is going to be quite open, discussion and some Q&A, introductions we have done. The idea basically is to kind of look at it from a 360 degrees around security, privacy, compliance. They're interrelated areas in a firm, especially in Fintechs, and they often get confused. It's a gray cloud, and the whole goal of this webinar is to kind of like break it down in terms of what that actually means in practice, especially around a very pressing post-COVID environment. So there's a bunch of topics here. We'll jump into these, but just to get started, let me ask Faraz, I guess, to start off, what is sensitive data for you, or what is sensitive data for a fintech?
Yeah, I mean, at the basic level, it's PII, any personally identifying information. So a lot of people think of PII as, you know, your social security number, but PII could be the IP address on your laptop. You know, the regs really define PII as anything that identify you as an individual. And as we know, in today's environment, that could be a lot of things. Going a step further, sensitive data for us could be any of our confidential information about our business. It is a very, very broad definition. And you know, one of the things that we struggle with as a startup is, if everything is sensitive, how do you classify that information, and how do you have different rules around it?
Alia, since you're the lawyer here, I will let you kind of describe it also from your angle.
Sure, I agree with everything Faraz says. And I would add that it's further complicated by the fact that depending on the regulations that apply to you, different data can be classified as PII additionally. So not only do you have the general bucket of personally identifiable information, but as you start to play in different playgrounds, including, you know, Europe or at the state level, that PII becomes even more complex, because some information may be treated as PII under regulation and some may not. And so when you're deciding as a company what you need to make PII or what you need to protect and what's sensitive, you need to kind of think about the whole ecosystem in which your business is operating and make sure that you're addressing every area and every bucket that might pertain to you. And then on top of that, add your business critical information. As Faraz said, that's, your confidential information. So.
But I think the one issue which I run into all the time in talking to customers is the definition of what's sensitive other than SSN and passport number varies quite a bit, and how it's handled. And I think, Ian, you can probably talk about that from first-hand experience in dealing with a very large number of financial services firms.
Yeah, most definitely. I think generally what we see and what we've discussed with clients is that they'll take the most stringent regulator and use them as the one to go with, right? The one rule to rule us all. So it was GDPR, then it was CCPA. So you kind of take the harshest regulator, if you like, and say, well, okay, that's the way things are going. Then we'll go with that and use that as the rule of thumb. So yeah, I think that's generally what we see with some of our clients that we work with.
And I mean, that brings up to an interesting point in terms of implementation of those things, where you're designing technology solutions, you're designing all these things where you're talking to two different stakeholders within a cloud project of a bank or a financial institution or a fintech, and they have different definitions. Risk finance could be completely different than what a compliance officer is thinking. So how do you kind of go over that in your implementations, Tim, when you're talking to kind of something what Ian just mentioned?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing for me is having those conversations early on, right? So that, the classification of what is sensitive and what's, what compliance, body we're going to, be governed by, or whatever the case is, that conversation for us should happen early. And we strive very hard to make sure that conversation happens, pretty much day one. I like to call it day zero, but day zero really isn't a thing. So let's call it day one. And the idea of, kind of having those early conversations is as you're going through the classification process, you're designing solutions around the classification rather than having to, redesign later on once you've found out that the scope of whatever is sensitive has changed.
Right. Except depending on where the data resides, right? Like something, an account number or a Medicare number for a patient, for example, bad example here, internally could be okay to be using, but as soon as it hits an assistant institution or externally, it certainly gets classified differently. So where it's found also is a big metric, big kind of like input into what the data means. And that's kind of where the challenges happen, right? And Faraz or Ian, if you want to kind of jump into that, who's able to kind of access it and when, either internally or externally?
Yeah, definitely. I think the whole conversation, and I'd say security and compliance officers are generally, to Tim's point, engaged in any interaction with a provider much earlier on than we've seen before. So I think that the trend is definitely in that way, and the conversation around on-prem, private cloud, external cloud, all those different things are considerations that people have to take into the matter. And some organizations, depending on maybe the region that they work in, for example, the Middle East we work with, tend to be very heavy on, it has to be on-prem. We can't have our information in the cloud just in case, because they haven't gone through that due diligence maybe. Whereas some organizations, some regions are very open to it. So yeah, it depends on the data. It depends on the regionality. It depends on the client information. It depends on all those different aspects. You could tick them off as you go through it as to what you should and shouldn't have access to. But generally, we find that, like I say before, like it's the most stringent rule. People aren't trying to cut corners on this anymore. They are saying, okay, well, this is the most stringent rule, so we will go with that one, rather than trying to say, well, we can kind of get away with it if we keep it here, because if you get a breach, if you get some sort of access, then all of a sudden it's game over.
Do you want to add something to that?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I agree with all of that. I think one of the, when Yasir, you were talking about who should own access or who should have access to data, I'm also thinking internally at the employee level, at the company level, who should have access to data. And that's, you as a company, as a startup, you have to make a very conscious effort to go through that exercise. So when I joined Bread, we were 4 employees and I was the 5th one to join. Even with 10, 20 people, you don't think about those things because you know everyone in the room. You know if someone's going to walk out with data, you can pretty quickly identify who it is. And so as a fast, high growth company, you forget that when you go from 20 people to 200 people, at some point you forgot to make that conscious effort to delineate who should have access to data or not. And I can tell you, we went through that exercise not too long ago. We've been in business for about 5 years. So, to Ian's point, and I think we all recognize is it's better to do it at the beginning. Really think through, okay, if you are an employee here, do you really need access to data to do your job?
And so, I mean, that it's a good segue into the question, Alia, in terms of like what Ian and what Faraz mentioned is a source of frustration for a lot of founders and a lot of C-suite executives in fast-growth companies is there's no clear answer. It depends on X, it depends on Y. And that's part of the challenge where how do you get through the weed of actually defining the process? Like, how do you kind of deal with your clients in terms of procedures and policies and governance frameworks?
So as our startup had the benefit of 2 privacy attorneys founding it. So this may not be how most companies do it, but I do think, and I think as Ian stated with GDPR being the strictest regulator, that you're going to start seeing things like privacy by design and security by design, which are kind of those amorphous topics of, okay, when do we do a risk assessment? Like as we're starting a project, as we're founding a company, and how do we design our applications from the ground up with these things in mind? And so we did that as part of our application design process, which was, okay, we made that as Faraz said, that conscious decision as to what was going to be considered, data that that no one within our organization wanted to actually have access to, what was going to be client level data, what was going to be, shared, saved, aggregated, and that kind of granular decision. If you can build those decisions, so from a security standpoint, at the same time as you're making business decisions, it becomes a lot clearer as to what you need to do. And I think part of that is a clearly defined business mission and what you want your application to accomplish. And if you want your application or your software or your solution to accomplish a specific goal, then you can start to cull the data that you won't need to accomplish that goal, or you can start to think through, okay, in 4 years am I going to need this data, in 5 years am I going to need it, and then you can start to really coalesce not only what data you need to collect, but who needs to have access to it, and how it might be used in the future in a reasonable way, so that you're not collecting too much data that you don't actually want. Because every piece of data that you collect that you don't need is a risk. And so from the very beginning, when they say you should be doing it now, that's because you want to not only design your application in a way that's forward thinking and that's protected, but you're also then setting good hygiene for not bringing on risk you absolutely don't need or want within your business. And so I think people don't think through that as much as they will going forward. I think it's becoming something much more top of mind, and that's something we think about in front. So
I mean, except the whole paradigm of a big data is to collect as much data as you can.
I know.
On it. So, but Tim, to that point, in terms of like, I mean, when you're trying to survive 6 months out or 18 months out, and I can attest to that, sitting in a startup myself, like, what can you do from a technology perspective to be able to set that up? Like, people have issues setting even Jira programs up properly, or agile methodology to be able to control their project on a day-to-day basis, like, let alone bringing in this dimension of sorry to rag on Ian here, which depends on X. Like, how do you think about that?
I think it comes down to conflicting priorities, right? Because you've got on one hand this idea of trying to be quick and roll things out fast and stay ahead of the market, and on the other hand you've got to protect the house. I do think there's a measure of designing with efficiency and moving with efficiency, wherein, you know, if you're trying to shore things up after the fact, which is typically a pattern that we've seen in the past, and something that I think is trending away from, is, you know, as you're trying to roll something out, let's just say for sake of argument, you give, you know, too much access to a particular group or to an account or whatever the case is. And the general statement is, oh, we'll fix that later. We'll come back and we'll fix it. We'll tighten it up. We'll tighten up the security stance, and we'll, you know, make sure we revoke access and all these sorts of things. The reality of it is it hardly ever happens. And when it does happen, it's a much more difficult effort to go in and figure out what holes you need to patch, versus if, you know, during that design and implementation process, you're thinking about those things up front. The troubleshooting exercise happens up front instead of after the fact. Which tends to lead to a much better security posture, because you're not having to figure out what you've left behind. And then ultimately waiting for something bad to happen to figure out you left something behind.
So Faraz, in terms of that, that's an interesting angle around I mean, we take on technical debt, but that's a legal or compliance debt you're building into the business. So you're saying this after we'll take into that. Do you mind just sharing, and you can be pretty vague about this, but like in terms of like your examples of what legal debt or compliance debt you took on, and like, all right, and then how did you solve for that, and or things which you've seen could have bite you, but you took it the right action, like some examples just to like flavor of that.
I mean, on the record, we have no legal or compliance debt whatsoever.
Your views are your own views.
I'm joking. No, obviously, we had, that's a great point Tim made. You know, my perspective is you know, we took a different approach to this for the most part, in that we decided to build compliance into the DNA of the company, which is why I joined the company early on. I had a compliance that joined early on, and it was, you know, Alia, like your co-founders, my co-founders were lawyers too, so they understood the regulations. They had the paranoia of people who had gone to law school, and so they were careful, but also wanted to build this area into a competitive strength of the company. So my perspective is the good perspective, hopefully, of having come in early and built the infrastructure from the ground up so that the foundation was strong, and the debt we took on later was fairly minimal. That said, to everyone's point here, when you're working in a high growth company, you can't always build everything the way you want to as a lawyer or compliance person. And so obviously the growth of the business takes priority. You know, compliance is only an issue if you have a business to run. Yasir, I think your question was, can I give examples of areas where we're taking on compliance debt? I mean, I think the one, you know, that I mentioned earlier comes to mind is around information security, thinking about employee access to data. You know, all of our employees go through background checks. You know, we trust all our employees, but not everyone has worked in a financial services company before. And so you may have a situation where someone who has never worked in this environment, a regulated environment, has access to all this data, and thinks it's okay to walk out of the office with that data, or to have it lying around their home as they're working from home. And, you know, that is an issue that we took on fairly late. And COVID definitely took us by surprise here, because now you not only have people, you know, who potentially have never worked in a regulated company, but now you have these people working from home. How do you secure data if they have their family members walking around their apartment? So that's, yeah, one area where I think we were on the defensive for a little bit.
I think like everyone else, but just around the table, Ian, I'll start with you in terms of what are the security privacy regulations that are coming top and center of the large and the mid-sized and the small-sized financial services firms in your experience, which are, at least people are investing in it or are looking to plan for it for the next 6 months or 12 months?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. So we obviously work with application builders, you know, from institutions to fintechs on a regular basis, you know, daily basis. And I think the the point that Faraz made, right? It's compliance and security. You never sell a product saying, yeah, we are compliant, we are secure. People expect that these days. However, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't spend any money and you shouldn't do it. So that's an interesting point. It's just it's a supporting function, but it's something that you have to have there. It's just an unfortunate fact. In terms of where people have been investing and the kind of, I guess, the main buzzwords, obviously MiFID II is a big thing we hear about. And I think GDPR, as I mentioned before, is still there, it's still valid. However, I think has been trumped by CCPA, and again, I think people are really just kind of focusing that on that's the main culprit in terms of it's the most stringent, it's the most prescriptive, it's got the biggest fines, etc., and it backdates, etc. All those different aspects. So yeah, I think those are probably the three which are the key buzzes that people are working on. But even working with trading floors who part of energy companies that have access to people can have access to nuclear power stations on their network. There's still a major security and a privacy issue that they have to solve. It's not quite the usual we're used to. It's not a regulated MiFID II, etc. But it's still some massive consideration that people have to think about when they're very first building their whatever tooling they're using, whatever applications they're building. They have to think about that right at the first forefront.
As a startup, what do I need to know, Alia, about CCPA, and what do I need to do like day 0, day 1? Or day 10, or do I need to do anything about that right
now? Well, you definitely need to do something about it right now. Yeah, I mean, they've started enforcing it in full force now, and they've actually moved to expand with some additional laws that have come into play as well with CCPA. So not only is it out there and it's in effect, but it's evolving actively. And so really, I mean, you need to think about what data are you taking from California people, and then you need to figure out, does it make sense to try and segregate that and work on it on its own? And you're probably going to come to the conclusion that it does not, and that you should then, again, as Ian said, you should treat all of your data as if it's being dealt with as it would under CCPA. And so there have been a lot of some of the teeth have been taken out of CCPA with some of the ways in which the large companies have influenced it, but in other ways it remains a fairly strict and prescriptive and onerous set of requirements. And so if you haven't been thinking about CCPA, you need to, if you can afford it, it's always best to get counsel to help you work out, whether you're compliant. If you're not there yet, and you're really just trying to figure it out, there's a lot of self-service resources that you can look at. I mean, we have an assessment that lets you evaluate your compliance with CCPA, but that I think is going to be something that, depending on how your business functions, may be not just, okay, I look at it once and I see I'm compliant with CCPA, but may mean, okay, I have multiple areas of business that touch different areas, and then I need to evaluate them, to see, okay, does this apply here? Does it apply here? Does it apply here? So that's where it can be complicated. But I definitely do think that if you ignore it, it's to your own peril.
But even if I have less than 25 million in revenue, even then you're basically saying I still need to be cognizant of it?
Well, I think you should be cognizant of it, because the fact of the matter is that unless you plan to always stay below 25 million in revenue, then sure. I mean, maybe it's not that big a deal. But if you think about, I mean, frankly, that would be a pretty short-sighted standard, because you're going to start to see it creep into your contractual requirements as well, along with your customers. So even if you yourself think, I'm not going to ever be, it's never going to matter to me, it's going to start hamstringing you from your relationships and your ability to build your business, I think, even if you don't anticipate going over 25 million. So
no, that's a great point. Yeah, we've seen Twitch or other companies being switched off, gaming platforms who do not comply with GDPR, And Grindr was a very famous one, which I guess happened about a few months ago. But for
Yeah.
that, from the contractual perspective, in terms of Tim, what are you seeing in terms of your engagement? You do a lot of cloud migration, data migration, very sensitive data, crux of people's kind of knowledge base. What are people asking you, or what have you seen from companies on the other side you're demanding from your integration partners or the cloud companies?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that point around the, what if you're 26 million tomorrow, right? Like it's always the foresight to know what's going to happen. I think what we see a lot is the constant balancing act of priorities, right? So, even when you think about, high growth in a business that's trying to succeed, it's that balance of you could make a full-time job. You could basically make the company do nothing but compliance, security, and, shore up holes and not actually have a business to run, right? So it's a constant balancing act and making sure that you're understanding risk where risk exists. I'm a big fan of making sure things like that are documented. So, to my point earlier around not coming back and fixing things, if things are documented and reported on, and we know these things exist, then we can make them a priority when they become a priority. I think, an earlier point around just the, is it on-prem, is it in the cloud? That's one of the biggest discussions we get into, and those lines are getting more and more blurred as time goes on. And I think it's an exercise in determining where the walls need to exist, making sure the walls exist, and then, kind of adapting whatever we're doing in terms of a rollout to, make sure that we're, within the guidelines of, whatever sort of standards have been set. So, and I totally agree with the thinking of everything as being sensitive information right up front. It's much easier to think of it that way than to think of the reverse side and go back after the fact and, kind of reclassify. So all of those things kind of combined to me kind of, are all kind of part of that balancing act.
I mean, but the defining what's sensitive, having a policy and a handbook in terms of, to Faraz's point, that's great. Where if you're a lawyer as a co-founder, then it's one thing, but 99% of the people don't have lawyers as a co-founding team or in the C-suite. So in reality, the issue ends up being everyone's busy. There's no resources online to be able to even think about, like, what do I do with privacy? You search privacy and the first 10 things you see is Semantic, Oracle, and all the other ones advertising you on the face, like, of solutions which are going to cost you $500,000 and above. So how do you build that culture? How do you build kind of like some very concrete points in terms of, anyone can take this question in terms of, like, what can I do with a 5% operation and a 25% operation in terms, or a 250% operation? Like how do I think about implementing this in a policy, just with some maybe illustrative examples?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in just to add more to the what and not so much the how, so as you're asking, which is, one other thing to keep in mind with privacy is that CCPA is one state, right? It's California. And for a long time, the US has had currently has a very decentralized regulatory environment. So Europe has GDPR, which I think is great. It's onerous, it's burdensome, but you know what you need to do. The US has a patchwork of laws across different states. So, privacy is just becoming, if not already, a trending topic among lawmakers and regulators, because it's in the news because of our social media peers. So it is only going to get more and more prominent. And when I say California is the first state, other states have to follow. It's just a cool thing to do now. And so you might as well invest in building that infrastructure early on, knowing you're going to be tackling with 50 other states in the near future. And so, Yasir, your question as to how do you go about building that culture? I think it really it needs to come from the top down. I think that needs to be a board level discussion of, if we're going to be operating in a business where we own sensitive data, it is an existential risk for us that we protect that data. And if we can't, then we will no longer be in business. So it is, just as you discuss revenue metrics, I think you have to discuss risk metrics as well, as both an investor and as a board. So I think it really needs to come from the top down.
That's actually very a good point. So, I mean, Tim, in terms of like how can that be implemented on the ground? Are we talking who has access to what folders, an IAM policy which is very well defined? Like, what would that shape look like, and how have you implemented that for your clients?
Yeah, I think this is a little bit where, subject matter expertise comes into play too, right? Because, especially as a startup, you don't know what you don't know. So it's easy to kind of focus on building the business without necessarily knowing how to navigate that landscape. And, to your point, you do a, Google search on compliance and security, and it's pretty scary. It's a little bit like the sort of WebMD sort of thing. You have a headache. The last thing you want to do is Google what a headache could mean. And, to me, it's kind of bringing in the right subject matter experts at the right time. It doesn't necessarily mean you're hiring on full time. Potentially that's bringing in the right folks based off of what parts of the business you're trying to improve, what solutions you're trying to roll out. In the scope of things like cloud rollout, it's, leveraging, quote unquote best practices, and I'm air quoting best practices because fundamentally best practices seems weird to me. But, at the very least, you're thinking about the security protocols and the things that those providers are doing to help you navigate that. Because it doesn't necessarily have to be a battle you fight on your own. But, it is a matter of kind of having to navigate at least partially through that water.
Ian or Alia,
Yeah, so I would 100% agree with Tim, and I think policies, and when you say that from either legally written policies or technical policies, is actually absolutely like the legal written policies have to come from the top, just as Faraz says, and then the technical policies have to be implemented in furtherance of that. But then I think the other kind of leg of that trifecta is training and making sure that you have buy-in from every single employee, so that if there is there is something that triggers that, okay, this isn't exactly right, or that thing will, like, is that email legitimate, or is this policy giving me access to something I shouldn't have? If you have that buy-in, which is really hard, it's a hard area, but it's also an area that's really important because so many disclosures and privacy issues come from employees, and oftentimes they're well-meaning and they're trying to do their jobs, and they're not there to subvert the system. They're just trying to work quickly, and they're distracted, and they choose to solve their business problem quickly without thinking of the security implications of that. And I mean, an example I have is when I was practicing law, I had a client that called me with, their controller had emailed 500 W-2s to Russia, thinking that the email had come from the CFO. And when the CFO walked past her office and she said, "Hey, did you get that email?" And he said, "What email?" They were like, "Oh my gosh." And so within an hour, they were on the phone to their attorney, and that's good. But the real question should have been, why would you need, would you have stopped, picked up the phone, called the CFO first and said, "Hey, did you really send me an email requesting this?" Or something like that, where you're talking about sensitive data, thinking first about, should I disclose this, rather than thinking about after you disclose it, whether or not it's an issue. And that's, I think, just a matter of training and buy-in and knowing from your employees that there isn't going to be any repercussion to thinking of that privacy of that issue before you take the action. And I think that's just kind of a sea change, and it does come from the top down to say, it's more important that we don't disclose this than that you respond to CFO in 5 minutes, something like that.
I think that the challenge also is, in general, culturally, knowing what's good looks like in terms of privacy compliance. We've had enough things happen in the news in the past, like 9 months or so. There are statistics saying 31% of all data leaks happen because of employee mishandling the existing tools or employee errors. So, Ian, in terms of like, twofold question. One is, do you have a sense of, do people on the ground, the users of OpenFin platform, know what good looks like from a privacy compliance perspective? And the second question is around, is there a demarcation of compliance, security, and privacy within organizations? Like in large organizations, they're complete separate groups, but like, is there a sense that that's changing also in terms of that's like a holistic end-to-end kind of a problem rather than individual buckets of issues to deal with?
Sure. I guess so. Obviously, two questions there, but to come back to everyone's points, like I think all of this comes down to time and money, basically. Do you have the time to put into this, and do you have the money to back it? Because usually you've got third parties coming in to to set up these online training courses or to do some reviews or whatever it may be. So yeah, time and money, and if you've got good funding as a startup, you're going to be in a good place for that. But unless you've got some legal in your team, which always helps. In terms of like OpenFin clients and the way that they address privacy and security, I think it's definitely front of mind, and it's definitely something that they understand and they want to address. I think the good thing is without going into OpenFin, we don't touch data or anything like that, so we're never involved with that. But it's always a question that people ask. Are you hitting our application servers? Are you seeing our data? And that's become more and more prevalent. Almost on every conversation we have with clients now, it's that conversation. So, and that's from a fintech to a large organization. I'd actually say, and this kind of goes into the second point, is actually large organizations, they're more worried because they've got such large, and dispersed and uncommunicative teams. Actually, the application builders and the people that are building these solutions, they're not so worried about it. They want to create something really nice that's really like client facing and really, really, really excellent. Then they'll bring security and they'll bring compliance and they'll bring the privacy teams in later. Whereas the smaller, the more agile fintechs and those kind of, technology first kind of companies, they kind of have it ingrained in their mind. Whether that's just the mindset thing that they've had from being startups, or whether that's just because in large organizations you have certain procedures and certain actions that you have to follow. Maybe, I don't know. But to answer the second question on teams and what we see in those organizations, I mean, yes, even in compliance there are multiple teams. Even in security there are multiple teams, and most of the time they don't like each other, they don't talk to each other, they don't want to interact with each other. So, as part of, as most people know, as part of a solution provider's job is to help interconnect teams internally, and to help them communicate and to help them understand solutions and the threats and the possible solutions that you have there. So, yeah, it's a difficult job sometimes, but I'd like to say it's getting better, but in all honesty, when you've got organizations that have got 10, 20, 30, 70,000 people working in, there's still a lot of issues.
I mean, historically, in my consulting days, I used to see the security officer will never talk to the compliance officer, and then the privacy officer was a late afterthought, which kind of came in, and then you realize that you're talking from a security demarcation was external threats, but then it kind of with this whole SaaS based architecture, that kind of started evolving also in terms of like, that kind of fits in with how people use those tools. So it's both internal. So then it's compliance comes in, and then there's the privacy officer comes in. Tim, in terms of your kind of engagements around like, are you seeing merging of those three areas, or are there some cross-pollination going on in terms of like these people talking to each other, these teams, or thinking through holistically?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, we are for sure, and I agree with Ian's point, right? Like the idea is to get all those stakeholders in the room, in the same room, communicating preferably. The issue primarily though that you still see, and this trend is changing as well, is it's not always, and I talked about day zero or day one sort of security conversations. The challenge being is oftentimes in the past, you'd end up with that day one security conversation that quite honestly finished at day one. Your first meeting was 20 people in the room. The next meeting was 10 people. The next meeting was 5. By the time you get into implementing the solution, it's really 2 stakeholders that are there. And in my mind, it requires due diligence across the whole, evolution of that rollout. So if you're rolling out a particular solution, have a stakeholder from the security or compliance team or both, kind of present through it, all of those things, because decisions get made every day, not just on the first day. And so it's not always good enough to just kind of have that leading conversation. It's got to be something where you've got those appointed stakeholders that are a part of that and participating actively in that rollout process.
Okay. I mean, that kind of interesting point over there for us in terms of like, what do you expect from your solutions provider from a technology perspective? And how much time do you spend, which is kind of what Ian's talking about, like due diligence of the provider itself? Like if someone is SOC 2 compliant, is that good enough? Like what are your kind of thresholds or kind of checks and balances?
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Tim.
No, I was just going to comment that it 100% feeds into that as well, right? And the whole best practices and subject matter expert side of the equation, right?
Yeah, that's right. So we just rolled out version 2 of our vendor management process, where we have oversight over our vendors. It is to do it correctly, you have to have a very thorough process. And by when I say doing it correctly, I mean doing what sort of the regulations require of companies like us, for example, financial services companies. The issue, of course, is when you're dealing with AWS and you ask for their SOC 2 report, they'll either literally or metaphorically laugh at you and say, okay, thanks, little startup. So it is difficult to work with larger vendors, obviously, who are probably doing what they need to do, or you think they are, but as a company, you still need to vet them to do your own due diligence. And quite frankly, they might not even be doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing, right? We obviously see that over and over again in the news. So it is a very difficult exercise. And when I say our process is thorough, it is thorough on paper. In practice, it is excruciatingly difficult.
Yeah, no, I mean, Ali, in terms of and then I have a few questions. I know we're a little short in time here. I've received a bunch of questions, but Alia, just last point to this cloud provider stuff, or this vendor certifications. If a vendor SOC 2, where do you draw the line, roles and responsibilities? Who's on the hook? Obviously, you as a customer is on the hook, but how do you think of a legal framework which I mean, this can just keep going. If you start down that path of as Faraz's point, I mean, it could be never ending. Where do you draw the line?
Right. So I think it's kind of a multi-tiered thing. You Faraz is talking about a vendor management process, which is critical. Having that process and then working it is critical. But then when it gets to the end of that road of, okay, I've asked for that SOC 2 report and they've laughed in my face, then you have to really look at your contract and what the liability comes out, what the indemnities look like. And at that point, you have a whole nother kind of hard, talk there, particularly with these larger vendors. As Faraz is saying, they're not going to necessarily change their standard contract for a small vendor. So it's at that point, you really have to think to yourself, okay, I have to weigh the inherent risk of working with this vendor versus how much liability they're disclaiming as part of our agreement, and then make that, either work through my insurer to make sure I'm covered if there's an issue, to tighten my process as much as I can from the diligence side. And to the extent that you can take that into third and fourth and fifth party, I think it's become something that's more important, particularly, and it's going to be driven by regulators more than, technology vendors, as to whether or not you need to go down the chain. I know the DoD is now basically releasing a new regulation that says not only does a prime need to be compliant, but every single subcontractor on that within that contract needs to meet a specific DoD regulation. And so if that becomes a standard that other industries start to adopt, you're going to start to see a flow through that's quite a bit more expansive than it is now. And we're getting into very theoretical compliance at this point. But the idea being that, one, you really need to look at your contract, make sure you're comfortable with the risk you're taking on, make sure you have any insurance that can cover you if you're on the hook for any liabilities that your vendors are disclaiming. And then, you also need to really take that time to button up your process, because you give yourself a defensible position. Even if the vendor isn't doing what they've said they're going to do, or acting in the way they should, if you've taken the time to vet them and to get that information from them, even if it's difficult, even if it's not perfect, you're giving yourself a defensible position if there is an issue down the line, particularly when it comes to disclosures to regulating bodies and and your examining body if you're a financial services institution. Right. So taking the steps to protect yourself isn't going to mean that you're buttoned up 100%. I mean, it's just not going to be possible, but having it in mind and not just throwing up your arms and going, well, it's too hard, I can't do it. I mean, that's going to be the part that I think the regulators are going to have the most issue with. Whereas if you said, I did X, I did Y, I did Z, this is how I approached it. That says, okay, I made this a business critical issue and I acted on it to the best that I could.
So to that point, and anyone can take this question, is like, yes, I'm SOC2, or as an entity myself, and I've got an ISO certification, I've got SOC2 certification. I'm all good, because that's the point usually, which is common across multiple startups, multiple fintechs, which everyone goes through. How do you guys perceive it? Question to, I guess, Ian, Faraz, in terms of, is that sufficient? Because that's where generally the buck has stopped in terms of implementing a compliance, security, and privacy program. Like, how do you, have you seen, Ian, from your customer base of app developers, and Faraz, just curious from what you see in the industry, also from the lending space. So this is related to a question which is being asked.
Yeah. So I guess to answer the question back, would you buy a solution that's half as good just because they've got double the compliance certificates? I don't know.
It's a
Probably not. I don't know. I think good enough is definitely good enough. If you can prove that you've gone that extra step further, but you're still delivering an incredible solution, then of course that's going to be more enticing to a user, well, particularly to a compliance team's checks. However, most organizations will have, if you meet this set criteria, which may just be ISO and SOC, that may just be it, then you're good. You're fine. But again, it depends what type of solution you have, what type of vendor you are, what type of information you're giving to them or taking. So it really depends. But typically, if you have a certain level, then you're fine. But you still have to deliver an amazing solution.
But let me rephrase that, and Tim, Faraz, like if as a fintech security officer, fintech founder, I'm SOC2, I'm ISO, I'm all good. I mean, that's the response I get. So I have a bone in this question actually to ask this: does that make you secure, and why not, if that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, you're good for now, but are you good? No, you're not. It's an iterative work in progress. You need to constantly improve your program. The certifications are good validation, obviously. It also means that you have built a program, so you have something. But the risks here are much more holistic than what these certifications cover. And so, the work gets more and more difficult because you have to find the places which are the areas of risk. It's much easier in the beginning, but no, it's, you can always be doing more.
Okay. Tim, words on that. You've gone through these kind of compliance issues as providing your services for cloud migration and things like that. Just curious.
Yeah, I think from the scope of a cloud provider or a place for your company's solution to run, I think my answer would be almost always going to be no in that case, right? Because their compliancy really pertains to the platform that they run and the data that they hold, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't open up the doors as you're implementing your solution, right? And so you still have to be aware of what potential pitfalls you're going to hit because you've opened up a certain set of firewall rules as an example, or you've made something public and you haven't necessarily locked things down, or you're allowing employee access to things that you maybe didn't think you were. That's over and above what a cloud provider's assessment is going to show or their certificate is going to show.
Got it. Last question for everyone, and there's a typo in here, but what I meant to say is, if anyone wants like a framework or a playbook, is there such a thing, and what would that be in 1 minute or less? Alia, I'll start with you.
I mean, as far as with whether there's a playbook, I think it's definitely going to depend. You're going to have to make your own to a certain extent, particularly because if you're a financial services company, you have certain regulations. If you're operating in Europe, you have GDPR. So it's not always going to make sense for you to go by this strictest possible compliance ever. Although many people just elect to do that, it may not make sense for you. So your playbook is going to have to be something that you design on a board level, and then you implement downward based on what you think is the business goals, you know, against the risk, against the various areas where you operate. So.
All right, Ian.
In a nutshell, no. Yeah, agree with Alia there. I generally think that there are best practices out there, and people, you know, are doing this on a daily basis, and they are doing it well. So it's always worth, you know, when you're part of a community of startups or fintechs, you know, talking to as many people as possible, understanding what they've done. I think everyone's always usually willing to share as much as they possibly can to those extents, and then find where you're comfortable. I think. You know, at the end of the day, like I say, everyone's doing it. You know, some good, some bad. So if you know people, then use them.
Okay, Tim.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
That's an easy out though.
Yeah,
that's a cop out. That's like.
So I'm gonna add some color to that though too, right? In that, you know, I kind of said that, you know, a lot of times as you're, you know, in a startup, you don't know what you don't know, but also you don't get answered what you don't ask. And so, you know, to Ian's point, there's lots of folks that are out there that are willing to share information and best practices and, you know, the right way to do a particular thing. And, you know, sometimes it just comes to asking the right question or asking the question at all. You know, and kind of, you know, community is a big thing, being able to, you know, participate in events like this as an example to, you know, potentially learn a new perspective or ask a question, I think are a big part of it for me.
For us.
Yeah, I wish I had something to add or something to take maybe the other position, but I agree with everyone. I mean, if there is such a thing, I haven't seen it, or it's if there is such a thing, probably not what a company should use. Privacy and InfoSec is a very bespoke process for each company. You need to build it according to your company. If you try to do everything, you'll get drowned in the hundreds of regulations. So you really have to pick and choose and really be tactical about it. So yeah, I think you should not follow the playbook if you.
Yeah, no, and that was the goal of this chat here in terms of like breaking through the clouds a little bit in terms of it's at the minimum. I think some of the attendees and people who will be listening to it and the notes they'll be getting later on. It'll resonate that they're in the same boat as everyone else, which can be good or bad. But there's definitely, I think, from the takeaways is day one perspective and having a sense from the top down that there needs to be some part of the budget spent on security, privacy, and compliance, which I still feel, I'm biased. People might disagree with me. Is a related thing. They should not be separate chief compliance officer or privacy officer or a security officer. I think these things are mingling on as the tech stack gets more intertwined. But yeah, no, this was great chat. Thank you so much for your time, guys, and appreciate it. Any parting thoughts from anyone from takeaways?
No, I guess one comment is that you know, we talk about talking to people and doing things ourselves, but I'm sure, you know, a KPMG and Accenture or one of those will happily tell you they've got a framework to come and implement for you.
For a price, of course, yes. But I'd recommend Alia to them instead. Better and more bespoke. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alia, Ian, Tim, Faraz. Really appreciate your time, and have a good day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.